The smoke smelled like oranges and old paper, citrus cleaner lifting from the table, singed edges curling into lace. I stood in my mother's kitchen with my palms flat on the cool marble, watching ash fall in snow-slow drifts through the brass grate of the fireplace. It was absurdly clean, the way disaster can be when it wears gloves. Outside, a gull scraped the sky like a hinge. Inside, my brother tapped a spoon against a mug, as if that sound could drown out the truth catching fire between us. "It was a mistake," he said without looking at me. "Mistakes don't smell like burnt envelopes." The letter had come certified, the green card still attached when I signed my name at 3:14 p.m., a number I would remember later because 14 was going to matter. "It's fine," my mother said too quickly, her voice skidding on the tile. I watched the corner of parchment fall and thought, paper remembers. It always had in our family, until someone decided to test it. Paper remembers. I am Arden. Vale, youngest child, quiet one, the person who balanced the hospice spreadsheet in Grandpa's final month and kept track of which nurse liked lemon tea and which liked her tips in cash. In a family that preferred noise to systems, I was the system. Grandpa would sit with me by the bay window, the light catching on his signet ring, and tell me how to keep the story true with a pen. Dates, amounts, who looked at what and when, he'd say, tapping a thick forefinger on the ledger. Memories are for the living. Paper is for the truth. He didn't say it to flatter me. He said it because he believed it, because he'd built a small shipping business into a modest fortune with checklists and patience. He left my brother Gavin the illusion of the captain's chair and left me the maps. The letter that burned had been addressed to me alone. It had my name on the outer envelope in Grandpa's angular hand. He'd planned for this, written it months before the fall that would begin the ending. The letter said there were conditions, not cruel ones. Just a reminder of the character he valued. No debt above a certain ratio, no borrowed advances, no subterfuge. He told me, softly, as if he were speaking over my shoulder while I read, that the trust held $540,000 in distributions earmarked for me over 2 years, and a second envelope would follow with the key to a small cedar cabin he kept in Maine. "If anything or anyone interferes with the delivery of your documents," he wrote, Red Clause 14. Later, when I thought about the flame eating the edge of my name, I remembered the way his mouth had twitched when he said, 14, almost a private joke. He'd taught me to move quietly. He'd taught me that not all noise is music. He'd taught me that people find out who they are when they think nobody's keeping score. My brother moved first, and he chose spectacle. He intercepted the letter. After I set it down to pour tea, lifted it from the counter with a joke about old paper, moved to the hearth with the ease of someone reaching for innocence. My mother, standing too close, smiled a smile that was really a plea, and watched the flames climb. "It's sentimental," she said without detail. "We don't need, and this must be a draft." She had always been good at that, speaking. In ellipses, leaving you to plug the holes with benefit of the doubt. The envelope was not a draft. It was dated in ink and notarized. It had a tab at the bottom corner with an etched helix Grandpa used as a seal. I had seen him order a stamp with that design. I had also taken a photo of the front when I signed for it. Habit, insurance, contempt for chaos. When a thing matters, timestamp it, Grandpa had said. It will matter to no one until it matters to you. The lever they pulled wasn't just the fire, it was gatekeeping. Gavin had always moved like a man who owned the room, even when the deed was still in Grandpa's desk. He controlled calendars and CC lines, decided which emails needed attention, and which were handled. The week after the funeral, he sent a group email about the trust that left me off the chain. Aunt Corinne forwarded it to me, as an afterthought, she said. The subject line read, Distribution Cadence, Operational Oversight. Inside, there was a schedule, vague enough to be flexible, with a single line that mattered, all documentation to be routed through acting co-trustee, GV. 6 days later, a second email arrived from a consultant, whose name, R. Kent, sounded invented. He referenced a standing stewardship fee and attached an invoice for $62,000. The invoice carried a logo that looked suspiciously like my brother's design firm's watermark, blurred and tilted. It was starred in my mind, a receipt to pocket. The shift was subtle until it wasn't. My access to the shared drive of trust documents vanished. It must be a settings update. Gavin texted with a shrug emoji that made my molars meet. He took phone calls on the deck, speaking in a voice just above a whisper, a performance for the wind. The mailbox began to hiccup. A certified letter tracking number, 9405 5113 8213 0020 1467, showed delivered in a scan, but no envelope ever appeared. When I called the local branch, a clerk told me she'd watched a man sign for it. I asked her offhand if the man had looked like a particular general description. She said yes. She said she would pull the camera. She said this because she had worked the counter for 12 years and had watched families turn feral over far less. Clause 14 is not a suggestion. The day after the fire, I drove to the trust company. I didn't call because calls could be redirected, forwarded, misinterpreted. I walked into Hallow & Shields at 9:02 a.m. and asked for the trust officer assigned to the Vale Family Trust. Revocable during Grandpa's lifetime, irrevocable now. They gave me a waiting room with too much beige and a pot of coffee that tasted like not giving up. When the door opened, a woman in a slate blue suit with a tiny scratch on her wrist held out her hand. "I'm Lina Cho," she said. Her hair was pulled back, functional and unshowy. Her eyes were the color of whetstone. She gestured me into a small glass conference room and closed the door softly, the way people do when they've decided to keep your confidence. I sat across from her and set a folder on the table with 3 things. The photo of the letter's envelope with Grandpa's seal, taken on my cracked phone at 3:14, a printout of the certified mail tracking number, and a still frame from the branch camera footage emailed to me by a clerk named Deirdre, a woman I would one day hug. In the frame, my brother's shoulder, distinctive from the way he'd broken his collarbone at 19, was turned toward the signing pad. Lina looked at each in turn and then slid a leather binder across the table with reverence. "If you're right," she said, "paper will remember." That was her line. Paper remembers. It landed like a chord I'd learned in childhood. "You know," I said, "he used to say that." Lina nodded. "Men who build things with ledgers tend to." We read Clause 14 together. It was a narrow paragraph in a forest of language, trimmed with Grandpa's particular humor. It said, in plain words, that if any beneficiary or agent attempted to interfere with the delivery of trust communications or materially mislead another beneficiary about their rights, the interfering party's next 2 scheduled distributions would be suspended pending review, and the trustee would be authorized to reallocate up to 50% of the suspended amount to the aggrieved beneficiary or to a named scholarship fund at Grandpa's alma mater. It also said that gatekeeping, including rerouting mail, filtering digital access, or accidental destruction of documents, would trigger an audit and allow for removal of a co-trustee by committee vote. Grandpa had underlined that last phrase, by committee vote. He had written, in the margin, a private thought, "Captain of the map." I traced the underline with my finger and felt something unchar my chest. "I have something else," I said. I slid across the printed invoice for $62,000 to R. Kent Consulting, stamped paid with a date of March 14th, the day after the funeral. Lina's mouth flattened. "If this is what I think it is," she said, "we're going to initiate a hold. It's not dramatic, it's just language doing work." I didn't raise my voice. I raised the standard. The move was precise and quiet. I signed a 1-page incident statement affirming the burning and the intercepted mail. I authorized a read-only login for myself with timestamp alerts. Lina typed notes with economy, the way a surgeon might stitch. She sent one internal message to Risk with a subject line as clean as a blade. Clause 14 trigger, hold next distribution pending committee. She emailed Gavin and my mother, copying me with a polite notice that, per the instrument, distributions were paused for 14 days while an inquiry determined whether any interference had occurred. She attached a PDF of Clause 14 and bolded 2 sentences, not advice, not commentary, just bright ink on a page that had waited for this exact human failing. When we stood to leave, she touched the binder the way a person touches a family Bible. "Ms. Vale," she said, "I'm going to say this once because it matters. People think silence is empty. It isn't. It is space you can fill with a choice. Thank you, I said. She smiled, brief and tired. Paper remembers, she said again. It would become a motif even when I didn't say it out loud. It would buoy me in the hours ahead, when the noise tried to make me forget who I was paying attention to be. Ash doesn't delete a clause. The fallout began before I reached my car. My phone lit up with the first of what would be 37 missed calls in a single afternoon, a number that would become a strange, private joke between me and the future. The calls came from my brother, from my mother, from an unknown number that turned out to be Aunt Corinne, perhaps calling from her car so she could pretend to be someone else. The texts were a choir. Are you serious with this? You could have asked me. It was just a misunderstanding. You know how Grandpa liked to push buttons? This is not the hill to die on. The last text in that cascade said something that cut and clarified at once. You're overplaying your hand. The irony of using poker language on the woman who had held the ledger would delight me later. In the moment, it pressed my spine to the seat and made me breathe until the air came back. By 5 o'clock, a man named Jeremy from Risk called me, not to scold, but to confirm. He was careful, his voice full of as per and pending, all the words that keep institutions upright. He told me a letter would go out to all beneficiaries notifying them of the pause. He asked if I was safe, an odd question until I realized the dossier of calls had its own weight. I'm fine, I said. And I was. In the way a safe is heavy and intact even when someone rattles it. He asked for the ashes. Just a photo, I said. But the corner with the helix, survived. He didn't exclaim the way a friend would have. He just said, noted, and I loved him for it. Somewhere before dinner, Aunt Corinne showed up at my apartment with a box of tarts and the eyes of a woman who wanted to be both Switzerland and human. She sat on my couch and spoke in paragraphs that tried to braid love and pressure into something wearable. You know your brother, she said. He's always hurried. He doesn't mean. He burned my letter, I said, not harshly, just like a weather report. She blinked. She looked down at her hands. He did, she said, and the room got quieter like the ocean taking a breath. He did, she said again. Then lighter. Do you remember when you were 12 and you wrote all the birthdays on index cards? She smiled at the memory to see if it could distract me. It couldn't, but I let it stay. Even amid fire, there should be a cake. 7. Missed calls is not an argument. The confrontation happened where they all do. At the table where we'd eaten Thanksgiving and signed mortgage applications and once argued over a dog. My mother wanted us to make it right, without dragging strangers into family, by which she meant without letting a room of people with bylaws read our worst impulse back to us. The table was set as if the ritual could trick the substance, a cloche over a roast that looked like it had been posed. Gavin sat with his shoulders wide and his hands spread, palms up like a saint in an old painting. Arden, he said, like a man rehearsing tenderness. This has gotten away from you. They're bureaucrats. They like to make tests out of everything. We can just. He made a vague smoothing motion in the air. Reframe. Reframe what? I asked. My voice was calm because I had practiced. The letter, the ash, the tracking number? He smiled, a kind of wince. You know, Grandpa, he said. He liked to test us. He loved games. It wasn't a game to intercept my mail, I said. It wasn't a game to invoice his estate. The mask slipped then. Masks always do where the table knows your hands. He leaned forward. You want to run the family with screenshots? He hissed. Clause 14 is a kill switch, Arden. It's not. He stopped, realizing he'd admitted familiarity he shouldn't have had. He wasn't supposed to have read that far before distribution. He wasn't supposed to know the clause like that. The room drew a shallow breath. I did not correct him. I didn't have to. He had told on himself. The pen was the loudest thing in the room. In the pause that followed, my mother said the line that mothers in our town said when they wanted to correct tone without touching content. We don't need to make this litigious. I set my hand on the table, palm down, the way Grandpa would when he ended a debate with a recipe card. "We're not making anything," I said. "We're honoring what's written. Paper remembers." It was the last time I ran from volume. After that, I let the institution arrive in its efficient, unglamorous way. The next morning, a letter on Hallow and Shield stationery arrived, same font used for things like land and consequence. It said the words that mattered: distribution paused, audit initiated, committee meeting scheduled in 7 days, allegations received, evidence logged, beneficiaries to be heard. I didn't ask for a savior. I asked for a process. During that week, my number became a metronome. I got up at 6, ran the short loop where the path smelled like pine and damp earth, sat with coffee at the small table in my kitchen, and wrote dates and times and names. I printed my photos, I printed my emails, and circled the headers where the CC line captured my absence like a watermark. I wrote a 1-page statement without adjectives so that the nouns could do the weight-bearing: envelope, seal, signature, burn, invoice. Paused. Lina called me once to confirm a detail. She did not counsel. She did not opine. She simply reminded me that the clause required calm to function. "It's just a lever," she said. "We pull it. We wait." I thought of an engine room, of valves hissing, of motion you don't see making ships cross water. Quiet isn't weakness. It's a plan. The committee room was smaller than in movies. A rectangle of glass and wood, a view of a parking lot, a geranium wilting bravely in a corner like a service member past her tour. 3 people sat at the far end: Jeremy from Risk, a woman with a silver bun whose name tag read A. Maldonado, and a man who never gave his name, which in that context was its own name. Lina sat to my left. To my right, an empty chair meant for any beneficiary who cared to show. Gavin arrived late, springing the door with more force than the door required. My mother came in behind him, subdued as a shadow. Aunt Corinne did not come. She had texted me a picture of a hand on a shoulder and the words, "I'm sorry," without specifying sorry for what. The hearing, if that's what we call it, lasted long enough for a pot of coffee to go cool. I spoke for 5 minutes. Reading my statement, I handed them my packet, a Word that has traveled from Manila to PDF without losing its shape. They asked me 2 questions, nothing rhetorical, both answerable with dates. They turned to Gavin with the same quiet. He began with a performance of bewilderment. Emails confuse him. Consultants approach him unbidden. He meant well, but ended with a confession shaped like a complaint. "It's not fair," he said. "You get everything with these systems. You hide behind—" I don't know what word he picked next because I stopped paying attention to his mouth and listened to the pen scratching on Jeremy's pad. In the room's economy of gesture, that was the loudest sound. A woman in the corner adjusted her glasses and wrote a single phrase. Clause 14 acknowledged. $540,000 wasn't a number. It was a boundary. The reckoning arrived in an envelope thick enough to be felt before it was read. The letterhead was the same. The content was different. It said the committee had voted unanimously to suspend Gavin's next 2 distributions per Clause 14, pending a longer audit of his role as co-trustee. It said $270,000, half of the suspended $540,000, would be reallocated to me immediately, as permitted. It said a further $62,000, the amount of the improper consulting fee, was to be repaid into the trust within 30 days, or deducted from any future distribution. It said, in a line that made my throat tighten, that the remainder of the Mayo suspended sum would be directed to the Vail Maritime Scholarship at the State College, Grandpa's named fund. It also noted that the committee would vote in 30 days on removal of Gavin as acting co-trustee for cause. It contained, attached, a login credential for me that was not read-only anymore. It ended with a line of small print that was, to my mind, the most romantic sentence I'd read that year. This decision is final under the instrument. The calls came again, in another geometry. This time, my mother's voice was thinner. She wanted to talk about optics, which is how people say they want to rearrange chairs on leaning decks. You could refuse it, she said, which was true, just not relevant. You could make a statement by not taking the money. I did make a statement, I said, by not taking the fire. Gavin sent me a text that called me a thief, and I looked at it as one looks at a portrait of a man who believes his mirror more than his neighbor's. I did not reply. I did not have to. The trust replied for me, this time in the language of wires, $270,000 arriving into an account I had set up years ago, because forward is a habit. A second email confirmed the $270,000 to the scholarship fund, a number that buoyed me for reasons that had nothing to do with utility. The cabin key came a week later, blonde wood on a brass ring, accompanied by a short note in Grandpa's hand that had outlived his hand. For when you need quiet, not a cave. I drove up on a Friday, the highway a line of rehearsal, the lake unfurling as if it had been waiting under its own claws all this time. The cabin smelled like cedar and old books. On the table lay a single thing, a chess set with the pieces. Mid-game, a note saying, "Your move." It would have been Twee if it hadn't been exactly him. I made tea. I took out the charred corner of the letter I had plucked from the grate with tongs when my mother went to answer the door, and my brother pretended to check the stump of a candle. The corner had the helix. It had the edge of my name. I pressed it between pages of his worn atlas and left it there, like a pressed leaf from a tree that still remembers the wind. Paper remembers. After the committee's second vote, removal, cause established, replacement trustee appointed, I met with Lina one last time in the small glass room, because I wanted to say thanks without email. She accepted the gratitude with the grace of someone who has been thanked by people on the worst day of their family life for a decade. "It's not just paper," she said, loosening her hair. "It's people choosing to respect it. That's the miracle, not the clause." "He thought he could make it disappear," I said. She looked out at the parking lot with its ordained lines. "Fire is showy," she said. "Ink is relentless." My mother and I have not spoken since the day she said optics. Aunt Corinne and I have a new rhythm that acknowledges both love and the fact that love without structure becomes pleading. Gavin will always believe that he made a reasonable choice with the letter. Men like him mistake proximity to the hearth for ownership of the house. The trust's audit unearthed other small shames. Nothing cinematic, a gas card used for a weekend away that wasn't approved, a subscription to a fishing magazine coded as maritime education. Their size was not the point. The point was pattern, the sigh. Quiet thing you sign becomes the loudest thing you live. I want to tell you there was triumph because the thumbnail text will want to shout 37 calls. $540,000 frozen. And that will be true. But the lasting feeling is not triumph. It is relief shaped like a boundary. It is the feeling of being seen by a man who knew me, and in knowing me, built a lane through his own death for me to walk, with dignity. It is the sense that every choice he made, the helix stamp, the committee vote line, the scholarship name, was a hand against my back in the moment when the people who were supposed to love me chose spectacle over structure, on a key. The last day of summer, I returned to my mother's house to retrieve a box of my childhood books. I did not go inside. I texted my aunt and asked if she would leave the box by the garage. She did. Inside, atop a copy of a field guide to shorebirds, lay a folded napkin with a single inked phrase in a familiar hand, copied by a woman who knew what it meant to a girl who had once written birthdays on index cards. Paper remembers. I stood in the driveway and let the ocean's breath find me. I knew then that closure is a word for locks, and what I wanted was a key. The final image I keep is ordinary. A brass key resting on an atlas page, the charred corner of a letter pressed beside it, and the small drag of the pen across paper making the line that made the law in our family, 14. Clause 14 is not a suggestion.